So this week we're sort of introduced to a couple ideas. The first is we're learning a little bit through the reading of the Gombrich text about Gombrich himself. And Gombrich is sort of invested in particular ideas about looking at the problem of art. And this is going to be one of the major themes of this class, is focusing on what do we do with the question of what art is. So this is something that I think is particularly prescient in our current time, because the very institution of art, I think, is up for a reevaluation, in part because the practices of art are directly linked to the practices of imperialism and colonialism, as are the foundation of public museums, which is another thing that you're going to see towards the end of this semester. The ideas that are formed during this time about visual image making lay the foundation for what comes after. And that's something that you need to keep in mind, because while we look at what's happened in the past and think of it as being behind us and sort of irrelevant, it still creates the circumstances of today. So what I'd like to do is to start talking about some of the artists that are inside chapter 10 of your text. And there's some material that is left over from the first section of this series of classes from AOWR, which talks a lot about the building of cathedrals, and that's sort of where we leave things at the end of the semester in 230. We reach the point where what's really happening is that art is being put into service for God, and the economy that exists at that time is largely based on either on a feudal system, and you've got two feudal systems. One is the political system, which basically has to do with land ownership, right? So you have the king, and then underneath him are the lords, and then underneath them are the people who serve and service the land, right? And then you have the same sort of hierarchy. There's God, and then there's the Pope, and then there are cardinals and bishops and priests, and then lay people, right? So there's this feudal structure that's set up that begins as a result of the plague to unravel. And that will be further cemented by the questioning of some of the practices of the Catholic Church. So this time period, the time period around just before the Quattrocento, just before 1401 and the marking of the Italian Renaissance, you have the Proto-Renaissance. And inside of it, through the work of individuals like Giotto, you see the beginning of the Renaissance. And Giotto was an artist, an Italian artist in Florence, who began to paint in a way that broke from the previous mold of painting. And prior to this time, artists were following, to most part, inside Western Europe, were following certain ideas about how things should be made, to the point where things had an uncanny similarity to them, and they almost looked stamped. And even individuals were not expressed with individual features. Their individuality was de-emphasized, and this had to do with this previous idea of not creating images of any particular likeness. So particularity was looked upon something that was a bad value, and Giotto changes that. So this is the Lamentation of the Christ from the Arena Chapel, which the Arena Chapel was created for the Scrovegni family, and it was a commission. And basically what's happening during this time of Giotto is that as a result of the plague, you begin to see class structure, this feudal structure, break down. Merchants begin to earn more money. People who work the land or who do labor for instance, building cathedrals, begin to demand higher wages as a result of the lack of able-bodied workers. And life in general improves for most of Western Europe as a result of the loss of population, because there is the same amount of land, the same amount of wealth, a similar amount of labor, and far fewer people. And so, as a result of supply and demand, workers are able to charge more, merchants are able to move up in class because landowners and the aristocracy lose numbers in the same way that the serfs do. So there's this chance for upward mobility. The class structure is less ingrained. And as a result, a couple things happen. First, you see a rising focus on the individual and a rising focus on spirituality and what happens to me as an individual after death. And as a result of these two things, who is commissioning art changes, as does what kind of art is commissioned. So in the first place, you have these families like the Scrovegni, who are merchant families who've worked their way up, who have money, and the way that they make money to invest in their business is by being users. And the best way that I can describe to you what a user is that it is a person who loans money and charges interest. And so what happens is, in Italy, in Florence and other places, these families set up tables and they set out their money and they wait for people to come up and ask to borrow money, and then they give them money, and in exchange, those individuals charge interest. And they earn this money and build up business and power this way. We're going to be talking next time about a family called the Medici, who are very influential. But today we're going to be talking about the Scrovegni very briefly and sort of introducing this idea. And they become patron of the arts. And the reason that they become patron of the arts is to compensate for their sin, because usury is considered to be a sin. So they do acts of penance by creating works of art in order to buy their way into heaven. So this practice is corruptive, right? And so we see this corruption in the church that's rising up during this time as people's behavior becomes more flagrantly against the wishes of the church, and the church sort of sells out its authority in exchange for great works being made for it. So the Scrivani commissioned the Arena Chapel from Giotto, and it tells the story of the Stations of the Cross. So basically tells the story of the life of Christ inside these pictures. And the thing that's so unusual about what Giotto does is that he makes an intentional attempt to produce realistic perspective. So you see inside the bodies of the angels an attempt at foreshortening, where the part of the body that is closest to you is depicted as if it is larger, and then the other parts of the body recede. There is an attempt to use linear perspective with this tree and the way that things are positioned. This is the point in the background. However, he's not very good at it. There's not a system. He's sort of feeling it through intuitively. The other place that you see this is inside the crowd, in which people are standing behind others and get smaller as they recede. So there's spatial consistency here. And rather than having sort of a heavenly glow, there's ambient light which is meant to reflect reality. So naturalism is what Giotto is striving for inside his paintings. And this is going to be fundamental to what follows after him. A couple of notes about this particular painting. It's significant because we see a couple of unusual things about this. You have the lamented body of Christ, and here is Mary holding Christ. So this is both a lamentation over the death of Christ as well as the Pietà, which is Mary's grief over the dead Christ. But you also have, through the inclusion of these figures with their backs turned, we are included inside the crowd. So rather than looking at a picture that has happened inside a framed window, Giotto has positioned us as members of the crowd who stand before Christ and lament his death. So we begin to see the influence of Giotto on other artists, but it takes a while for this to sort of permeate others' works. So for instance, inside, you see this is Christ entering Jerusalem, also from the Arena Chapel from 1305 to 1306. And you see the work of Duccio from 1308 to 1311 inside the Siena Cathedral on the left. And while Duccio is borrowing from some of the ideas of Giotto, he is utilizing architecture in order to create a sense of space and perspective. He is creating a crowd that appears to be behind Christ. He is not as effective at it as Giotto is. And Giotto's space feels more contemporary and more realistic than Duccio's. And this again is a comparison between Duccio's Kiss of Judas versus Giotto's. So again, we see the influence, but we still see the use in Duccio's work of the gold leaf and some sort of strange affectations the way that the halos are placed, for instance, these are face on no matter how the body is. And as you see here, the halos are attempted to be put in perspective by Giotto. So this is Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi's Annunciation. This is also for Siena Cathedral. This was from 1333. And we can see that there is some added naturalism from the influence of Giotto, and yet there are still some affectations from the Gothic time. So this literal light, which would be reflected on and show into the scene. So one of the things that your books talks about is the creation of public buildings, and this is the Palazzo Pubblico, which was constructed between 1297 and 1310, and it contains artwork of both Simone Martini and Ambrosia Lorenzetti. Building projects begin to turn away from cathedrals and towards public buildings that had other uses, as you begin to see urban centers build up, and as people move from the farms into more urban centers. Inside of it, we see the work by Lorenzetti, Effects of Good Government in the City and in the Country. And this was created from 1338 to 1339 and is about 46 feet long. No, 46 inches, I'm sorry. Okay. Meanwhile, in France, we have books of hours are still being created. Again, these are meant to lead people through prayer. And this is the hours of Jean Devereux and Jean Pucelle. And this particular page is the Kiss of Judas and the Annunciation. So we see how a similar theme is being depicted in France. And so then that brings us to the Florence Cathedral. So this was begun in 1294, but it wasn't completed until Brunelleschi solved the problem of the dome. And so for a while it sat undomed, in part because no one could figure out how to create a dome that would cover it. The technology was just not something that they remembered or had access to. So they were trying to find a way to create a dome that would fit on the cathedral, and they just didn't have the technological know-how to create it. And Brunelleschi would be the one who would end up solving the problem of the dome. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. So then we have the Siena Cathedral, which was intended to be expanded upon. However, because of the Black Death, because of the Black Plague, the work on that expansion stopped because of the loss of workers. And so you see this shift that begins to happen away from more sizable architectural projects to smaller, more intimate works. Because cathedrals at that time period were taking hundreds of years or decades at the very least to be completed. And so people wanted projects that required less work, that demonstrated their penance in sort of a more rapid fashion, and were things that could be admired within their own lifetime. So this shift begins to happen. So during the 14th century, the issue of patronage is something that begins to shift, as we talked about in the introduction. In the Italian city-states, we see this shift to merchants. This happens again in France and England, as well as in Germany. And one of the major families who were patrons was the Medici. And the Medici were actually patrons of Filippo Brunelleschi and his work in completing the Florence Cathedral. So one of the things that the Medici thought at this time period was that by completing the work and by finding the person to complete the work of the Duomo, or the dome at the top of the Florence Cathedral, that they would gain great fame. They sought out, through a competition, to find an artist who could complete the project. And so various people were preparing to submit ideas to this contest, and Brunelleschi suggested, according to the art historian Vasari, Brunelleschi suggested that they use an egg, and anybody who could get the egg to stand up on its end would win the commission. And people tried and failed to do so. And then Brunelleschi came up, he smashed the egg down on the table and broke its bottom, and what remained of the egg stood upright in its shell. And the other surrounding artists and architects said, well, we could have done that. And he said, well, if you had my plans, you'd be able to complete the dome as well. And so he received the commission. Brunelleschi is, in addition to completing the Duomo, he was the one who invented, quote unquote, perspective, linear perspective, or the system of linear perspective during this time. And the beginning of the Renaissance is marked by the competition to create the doors of the baptistry of St. John in Florence. And this happened in 1401. Brunelleschi was competing with, among others, Ghiberti. And what they were supposed to do was to create one bronze work for the commission that was based on the sacrifice of Isaac. And so Ghiberti won, and Brunelleschi lost. And this is a piece by Brunelleschi, and this is the piece by Ghiberti. Some think that the awkwardness of the form here, as well as the general busyness, detracted from his winning. But as a result, the start of the Renaissance was begun. One of the reasons why we think about the Renaissance as a thing is because of the work of Giorgio Vasari. And he was a Mannerist artist who compiled narratives of the lives of artists from Italy and the Italian city-states during the Quattrocento, and marked it off as a period of time in which incredible things happened. And he called it a rebirth of the principles of Greek and Roman art. And that is how we have come to know it today. So that's sort of where we're going to leave off.